With the release of the new Admech Battleclade, as part of the Killteam Typhon box, I knew I definitely had to pick it up and do something with it, as I've been waiting on it for a while. Admech was one of the last armies to get a dedicated kill team, having to just reuse full army units until now, and it has been a while since they've gotten many more units in general. I like Killteam quite a bit, the smaller scale and having more control over individual units, as well as the kits themselves getting the chance to be more unique and exploring styles that don't have to fit into full armies. Overall, it gives the kits great potential for converting with, and so the wait for the Admech Killteam inevitably had me building up ideas and expectations. Because of the models I converted to use in Killteam games before, I expected some specialised troops, like some veterans or variants of Skitarii and Sicarians, led by a new tech priest, to be some equivalent to the Necron Killteam. The actual official battleclade Killteam delivers on some of that, with some servitors, most being specialised in some way or another, and 2 tech priests to lead them, one of which is new. This is by no means a bad Killteam, it's a good addition to the army, a new style of unit while still being aesthetically consistent, and I was happy to pick it up. But I had a slightly different Killteam in mind, and so, as is often the case, it makes for a good conversion idea. My initial plan was to use some of the parts for the regularly sized servitors to customise some Skitarii with, as I have developed a fondness for the little guys after having built so many, and so prefer them over servitors. The gun servitors provide a nice bulky base to try a different type of larger Skitarii from an older book that has been an idea stuck in my mind. And for the tech priests, the techno-archaeologist, I'm not really counting as it's already an existing model thrown in that was already repackaged from Blackstone Fortress, but the new Servitor Underseer is a nice addition with a unique silhouette I can make some simple changes to. To actually get to building these, I broke them up into a few sections, the first half being the small servitors, which includes the 3 basic combat servitors and 3 specialists, the Breacher, Technomedic and Autoproxy. Since there's more than a handful of these, I wanted to focus on relatively simple conversions that wouldn't take a lot of work on my end, but result in different and unique minis. So changes along the lines of arm and head swaps, using the servitor arms, heads and backpacks on the Skitarii torsos and legs. For all of these, I did try to match the arms, bodies and heads movement and direction wise, like matching the arms bent at the elbow and being held forwards like in a running pose, for the bodies and legs that are mid-stride, and trying to keep the heads pointed in the same direction it looks like they're running or pointing weapons. Those parts fit together pretty easily, just needing to trim some of the wires on the sides of the Skitarii torsos so the arms fit flat. But they are all in the Admech aesthetic, so they all visually matched. For the 3 plain combat servitors, I did include a few minor changes, just because I want to try to avoid building the same thing twice, so everything is somewhat unique in its own way. The first mini was the most basic, a kind of control design and proof of concept. Just servitor arms and backpack, with Skitarii legs, body and head. The next combat servitor, I swapped out the head for a servo skull from the Battlefield Trophies kit, just connected with wires. I always like working in servo skulls, and it worked well to represent how my custom Forge World is forced to reuse parts and recycle scrap, to the point where even their Skitarii still get used even after their fleshier components wear out. The last basic combat servitor, I wanted to vary the weapon placement, so I cut off its arm weapon to mount it on a Skitarii backpack, and just replace the arm with parts I cut down from a taser goad. For the 3 specialist servitors, all their parts are fairly unique, so I didn't need to do a whole lot of changes. I just used the Technomedic's arms, head and backpack on Skitarii torso and legs. I did mostly the same for the Breacher, though I used a Skitarii helmet which had a bit more armour plating, which felt appropriate. And I did need to cut off the wires built into the parts, as they didn't line up correctly on the new body. But they were simple enough to replace with actual 1mm aluminium wire I just glued into holes I drilled where the previously built-in wires were. And the Autoproxy was pretty much the same again, just opting for one of the Alpha Skitarii heads instead, since it feels like this unit is functionally the leader within the servitors. After the servitors, I moved on to the new Tech Priest, which does have an interesting design as is, but I rarely leave a model unconverted. So instead of a kit bash like the Servitor Skitarii, I went for a simpler conversion type of just adding a part or two. The bulbous shape on its back is an even more extreme posture than what's seen on other Tech Priest, and gives it a very unique silhouette. But to me, it seems a little isolated or standalone, like it should be connected to more. And also, when coming up with ideas for what to do with this, flipping through the Killteam booklet to see what info about it could inspire a conversion, I noticed this model is specifically called a servitor underseer, but I turned its usual servitors into Skitarii, so adding some servitors to the model itself seemed like a fitting idea. I had enough spare servitor parts from the battleclade kit itself, and having some directly controlled servitor torsos sounds appropriate for a Tech Priest. Basically puppeted disposable body shields and weapon systems that could be swapped out or replaced easily, and that can be semi-autonomous or directly controlled when necessary. I started off by trying to connect them with some of the gun servitor's mechanical legs, since I like the design of them, but they were a bit too bulky on the very lightweight Tech Priest. So instead I tried some of the smaller mechanical arm parts from the Cataphren kit, which matched a bit better, but just needed to be supported with some paperclip wire to be securely connected. For the servitors themselves, I kept them to torsos, arms and heads, so they match the light floaty Tech Priest, and I also changed their weapons to match the options on the Tech Priest. For the guns, I swapped the phosphor blaster part of the weapon limbs with radium pistol parts cut from the Tech Priest's arm and another from the Skitarii kit. And for their other arms, I gave them a series of mechadendrites, made from the Tech Priest data spikes they're meant to stand in for, along with other random wires, some ending in the pincers and clamps from the original servitor's arms. And for the servitor torsos, I tried to detail where I've removed the lower half with some plasticard cut into various shapes, to give them some sort of mechanical separation, which I also glued some loose wires into. However, after initially assembling them, the arms did seem a bit lacking where they joined the torso, so I temporarily cut them off to put in a shoulder piece taken from some heavy Cataphren arms. Then I just finished the building of this model off by putting a few more wires into place to connect the Tech Priest to the servitors, and replace the pistol hand of the Tech Priest I cut off earlier with a claw from Cataphren arms. As mentioned, for the other Tech Priest of this kill team, the Techno-Archaeologist, I will just be using my old conversion of the model. It may be a little lazy to just reuse the old model, but Games Workshop did the same thing for the kill team itself, so I figure it's fair game. And so that just left me with the gun servitors to convert, for which I had an idea I've been wanting to try for a while, but it would need to be quite the heavy conversion, down to swapping and customizing specific parts of limbs, and detailing a few things on top. The idea comes from a novel I listened to the audiobook for, which is often a good source of building inspiration, especially for the ones that came before 2015, as that's when Admech got their army and models, despite already existing in lore for a while, so descriptions of the faction before then are much more varied and different. The specific idea comes from the Mechanicus novel by Dan Abnett, which, as the name suggests, follows some legios of titans, but they are often accompanied by Skitarii infantry. These Skitarii are described quite differently to the modern models, still cyborg soldiers, but with references to being gene-bulked, having weapon limbs, being developed for aggression and strength, and even some animalistic qualities. They gave me the impression of more advanced techno-barbarians, at times almost comparable to some of the lower ranks of the more technologically inclined Space Marines. And also based on these book descriptions, there are these great designs by Alex Beals I'm also using for reference. The bulkier bodies of the gun servitors seem to me like the perfect base to make these bigger and meaner Skitarii, that for clarity I'll be calling Skitarii Praetorians from now on. And for other bits, I'd be taking a few parts mostly from Cataphrons, Titanicus scale Questoris Knights, and some Mechanicum Thalax models. The torsos and heads from the base models were a good starting point, but I wanted more mechanical legs, like regular Skitarii, so for one I used Thalax legs, and the other I used some from Questoris Knights. And that one did require a piece of plasticard to properly space and attach the two halves. Using Titanicus scale knight parts can be pretty useful, but I find they're very visually recognisable, so I did a few things to change the legs here, like adjusting how they connect to the waist, attaching the shin armour upside down, swapping the feet for those from the normal gun servitors, and later adding exoskeletal thigh supports taken from Cataphren manipulator arms. For their arms, their weapons are normally mounted straight to the shoulder, but that's just a weapon, not a weapon limb, so I needed to find some upper arms to attach them with. I tried a few things, but in the end I went with an arm made from cutting down one of the unused gun servitor legs, and another upper arm section taken from a tech priest mechanicus. And the guns themselves are the bolter and arc rifle options from the base kit, but made a little smaller, swapping the back half of the bolter for a smaller one taken from a Kataphron, and removing the top section of the arc rifle, which I later just put a Skitarii backpack optic in its place as a weapon sight. Then for their other arms, even though the weapon profiles of the gun servitors don't fully need them, I wanted to include some melee weapons to roughly match the inspiration and art. For the bolter Praetorian, I started with a Kataphron heavy arm, cut above the elbow and reattached to alter the angle, and I replaced the bit at the end with a Questoris fist, which I find works great as an Admech styled power fist. Then, on top of that, I used some other Kataphron heavy arm parts to turn it into a power claw weapon. And for the arc rifle Praetorian's melee weapon, I wanted to try something like a power halberd or poleaxe, and made use of other Killteam and Necromunda parts for it, as they are a great source for more unique bits. I used a Gormonger's chain blade, with the hand of the original Gormonger trimmed down, and replaced the blade at the end with a Necromunda Squat's power axe head. For the arm to hold the weapon, I used the muscular arm from one of the original gun servitors, and swapped the bit at the end with the mechanical hand from the other gun servitor. Then, with all their main parts done, I could get to adding details. To bulk out the skinnier waist of the bolter Praetorian with some engine-like parts, I used one of the gun barrels from the Killteam's regular servitors, which I wired up, using some 2mm coiled wire from Zinj Industries to connect it to the backpack. And on the other side, I bent some plain 2mm aluminium wire to connect it to a Questoris flamer weapon on the back of the backpack to work as a kind of exhaust. For some cloth type of details around the waist, I rolled some green stuff out very flat and cut it into a few different shapes. Just a single central piece for the bolt Praetorian, but for the arc rifle Praetorian, I tried to lay it a few smaller pieces. One central one in front of each thigh, and then two thinner strips between them. I wasn't particularly satisfied with the way the green stuff turned out, but did plan to try and make them a bit better by building on them. For that, I used some armour panels taken from the Kataphron kit, which is also where I got the shoulder pads for both of these. I just used one of the tank tread armour flaps for the bolt Praetorian, and I cut down a panel from the waist armour for the arc rifle Praetorian, which I used alongside some 1mm coiled wire from Zinj Industries to try and help smooth the transition between the waist and the legs. Also on that unit, I added one of the smaller Kataphron manipulator arms to the back, as it gives some explanation as to how that unit could wield its poleaxe with just one hand. Then, I also very carefully cut down a faceplate from an arcoflagellant to attach it to the servitor's headpiece, which is quite a small detail, but one I've done a few times and always like the look of. Finally, the last few build details of the Praetorians, along with various wires, were just some backpack cameras, one taken from a regular Skitarii backpack, and the other I got from a Tempestus Scion. To base all these guys, I went with the same style as the rest of my Admech, kind of industrial ruins to represent that almost destroyed Forge world. To make it, I start with plasticard, which has patterns like grids or double diamonds, which I glue to the base and cut to match the shape. On top of that, I usually add a few loose wires, which I normally have left over from green stuff wire detailing. For an extra touch on some, I sometimes add leftover cut-up bits I have, and this time I also added small debris piles made up from the offcuts of the plasticard. And after priming and painting, I also add some texture paste, either on the sections I leave plain or on top of the plasticard parts. The only slightly different base was for the tech priest, since it's kind of intricately connected to a stand with some modelled base details. Instead of the pattern plasticard, I just used more debris, in the form of corkboard chunks, later covered with texture paste. But I think I kept it consistent enough with the other bases as it still has the same wires and debris. But that wrapped up the building, and I moved on to the painting, which, to keep consistent with my Admech army, I used my usual grey and orange colour scheme and painting methods. Starting from a Chaos Black Spray Can Prime, I heavily dry brush on one of the main colours, a dark silver in the form of the Iron Warriors paint, which quickly covers most of the model while leaving the recesses in the black primer, so it's already got some level of shading. Then on top of that, I lightly dry brush the lighter silver plate armour from Tooth & Coats, which works as a quick highlight. Then for the other main colours, I did the more standard painting with a regular brush, using mechanicus standard grey for any robes and some armour plating, then Balthazar gold on any trim and also for any mechanical details I wanted to pick out. I used rat skin flesh for the orange on the inner robes and on wires in areas I thought were lacking in that bright colour. For the other wires, I used corn red and cabalite green to introduce some other colours to the model, but they're still on the darker side and only small parts, as to not distract from the main colours too much. Then it's only smaller parts left, like using Rakarth flesh on any bones, flesh or purity seal scriptures, and the off-white Celestra grey for any glowing parts like eyes and optics, which leads to the next step. I make use of a few contrast paints for quick and simple effects or to slightly change the colour of other parts. I use Athematic blue to tint and give a simple glow look to areas I previously painted with Celestra grey, and I use Black Templar to darken some metallic areas and wires, which also dulls the shine of the metallic paint for a different finish. With all the base colours on the model, I added a few decals, all taken from the Admech transfer sheet, for stuff like squad markings, symbols on a few shoulders and waist sections that seem too plain, and also for the detailed trim on the Tech Priest's hood. Once they were fully applied and dried, I moved on to shading the model by applying washes. The metal areas were already somewhat shaded from the initial dry brushing, but the other colours weren't, and a bit more shading on the metal wouldn't hurt either. If you've been paying close attention to my previous videos, you may notice I've been trying various paint lines, washes and shades, and this time it's come full circle and I used Citadel's Nuln Oil and Agrak's Earthshade, applying the Nuln Oil to shade the metal and grey parts, then the brown Agrax for the copper, orange, flesh and bone areas. Painting the bases is somewhat similar, dry brushing dark metal at the start with the rest of the model, painting the wires in darker colours like corn red, cabalite green, black templar contrast and also warp block bronze. Then I apply the texture paste. I normally use Astro Granite Debris, but that's now discontinued and I'm almost out of mine. The regular Astro Granite doesn't quite give me what I want, so I started testing out Proacryl's Coarse Grey Earth, which is mostly similar, but just slightly darker and has more bits, which results in an even bumpier texture. Once that's dried, I dry brush it with Dawnstone to highlight it and make up for the paste being darker than my normal one. Then afterwards I shade the whole base the same as the model with Nuln Oil and Agrax. To finish up the painting on the models, I did some simple highlighting, going over some of the raised and most prominent areas with the original paints, to brighten select parts after shading. And for the main colours, I highlighted the most raised edges with paints a shade or two brighter than the base colours, using Dawnstone for the grey, Tooth & Coats' plate armour for the silver, and Hashut Copper for the copper. And that's how I made this Skitarii battleclade Killteam, using the parts I liked from the new Killteam kit in different types of conversions to make a custom team a bit more like ones I've played with before, while also exploring a few new ideas. I think it's a good squad overall, with some great variety across the units, and also makes for a nice addition to my full Admech army, which I'm continuing to add to with my next few planned projects. If you want to keep up with that, I post work in progress pictures regularly on Twitter, Instagram, and a few other places linked in the description. If you want to help support me, and also get something out of it yourself, I now have an Element Games affiliate link, which I'm quite happy about, as my go-to local game shop is an Element Games, and it's my first stop anytime I buy full kits, paint, tools, and materials, because they're discounts and good range of models and hobby supplies. It's even where I bought the Killteam Typhon box this battleclade came from. So where possible, I've linked to the kits and tools I've used for these minis on their site in the video description using my affiliate code. And if you want to support me more directly, I have a Patreon, where supporters get weekly project updates, posts about future build ideas, a look at future plans, early access to videos and finished model pictures, and more. I'd like to thank those currently supporting me on Patreon, who are Kyra, The Lich's Laboratory, Philip Mitchell, Talleyrand, Morse Going Free, Gamrus, Quirky Perceptions, Beadwag, PP, Hosea, and Yaroslav Altunin.